One of the most influential glam rock acts of the 1970s, Brian Connolly provided the band's golden voice. Very nice. Ballroom Blitz and Fox on the Run were two of his many chart-topping singles that ushered in a new era. However, the reality wasn't as charming as it appeared, hidden beneath the glitz and celebrity. The strain and scrutiny that came with fame ultimately broke the band. Something bleak happened in Brian's life. From sold-out arenas to empty watering holes, from fame to hardship, his last years were a time of coming clean about his inner turmoil and the reasons behind his complete collapse. Come along as we reveal the raw emotion and truth behind the song. However, we must return to the beginning in order to comprehend the context. Brian Connolly's early adventures. Hamilton, South Lanarkshire was the setting for the 1945 beginning of Brian Connolly's narrative. He had a really difficult beginning to his life. Frances Connolly's mother abandoned him in a Glasgow hospital when he was a baby. Frances was a teenage waiter. His biological father remained a mystery. Jim and Helen McManus, a generous couple from Blantyre, took up little Brian when he was 2 years old. They brought him up as one of their own and named him McManus after the family. Unaware of his actual heritage, Brian grew up believing they were his biological parents and went by the name Brian McManus. But it all changed when I became 18. That he had been adopted was relayed to him. In light of the revelation, he chose to reclaim his maiden name, Connolly, as a tribute to his mother. An ongoing quest for self-discovery began with this finding. Since he looked so much like Mark McManus from Taggart, rumors circulated that the two might be connected. Some went so far as to think they might have had a common paternal ancestor. It lent an aura of intrigue to Brian's tale, regardless of its veracity. Brian had ambitions to join the engineering profession when he was a young guy. His goal was to live a simple, steady life, therefore he studied the craft. Music, though, had a secret pull on him. He was the life of the party thanks to his charisma, excellent appearance, and silky voice. Although he was unaware of it at the time, his voice would quickly establish him as one of the most iconic singers of the 1970s. Coming into his own. When Brian joined Wainwright's Gentlemen, he embarked on his musical journey. Having performed in and around Hayes, Harrow, and Wembley, the band was already well known in the London region. One of the fathers was their manager, and the group played for local clubs and even went nationwide. They played at the Lyceum Strand as part of one of those contests, and BBC One aired portions of the performance. The band's lineup had changed multiple times at that point. Ian Gillan, who would go on to head Deep Purple, was one of many famous people who went through its ranks. Brian Connolly succeeded Gillan as lead singer after Gillan departed the band in 1965. There was an immediate effect of his talent and enthusiasm. Afterwards, Brian's drummer from back then, Mick Tucker, became a close buddy and colleague. They wanted to start a family together because of the amazing chemistry they shared. In late 1967, after performing with Wainwright's Gentlemen for some time, they chose to depart and pursue other interests. The Sweet was born, marking the beginning of a much larger project. The Sweet Shop was Brian and Mick's new band that they started in January 1968. Guitarist Frank Torpey had previously played with Tucker, and they recruited bassist and vocalist Steve Priest from a band named The Army. On March 9, 1968, the band debuted live at the Hemel Hempstead Pavilion. Even though they began modestly, their enthusiasm quickly caught on. They stood out, were entertaining, and had a memorable sound. Paul Nicholas, who shot to fame as one of the leads in the hit musical Hair, was the band's manager. Record producer Phil Wainman, who was impressed by the youthful band's enthusiasm and sound, was a close collaborator of Nicholas's. Fontana Records released their debut single, Slow Motion, which he assisted in recording. However, the band had to rebrand themselves right before the album's release. They decided to abbreviate Sweet Shop to just The Sweet because another artist was already utilizing it. It stayed because it was memorable and easy to remember. They were disappointed with the success of their first few singles. Despite recording multiple songs, none of them were chart toppers. After 1 year with the band, guitarist Frank Torpey decided he had had enough and quit. Brian and Mick persevered through the difficult times. They would not back down. They persevered through the highs and lows thanks to their self-assurance and ability to work together. The lineup that altered the course of events. The group went through multiple lineup shifts following Torp's departure. In 1969, guitarist Mick Stewart became a member, bringing with him a history of rock bands including Johnny Kidd and the Pirates and the Red Caps. Concurrently, the suite inked a new recording contract with the Parlophone label, which is owned by EMI. Get on the Line, Lollipop Man, and All You'll Ever Get From Me were their 3 hits. Still, not a single one of them became popular. Brian remained resolute in the face of adversity. He was adamant that the band might become famous. Then destiny intervened once more. They were introduced to 2 young writers, Nicky Chin and Mike Chapman, by producer Phil Wainman, who Brian and Mick reconnected with in 1970. They were seeking a band to perform their compositions, which had a reputation for being infectious pop successes. The vocals for a demo titled Funny Funny were recorded by Brian, Mick, and Steve, with session musicians providing the instrumentation. Word got out fast when Wayman began pitching the tune to record companies. At about the same time, the band discovered Andy Scott, a gifted Welsh musician, during auditions for a new guitarist. Andy had experience playing with elastic bands and working on scaffolds with Mike McCartney, brother of Paul McCartney. He was the ideal match, playing guitar, bass, and drums, with Brian serving as the lead vocalist as Andy. The suite's traditional lineup was restored at last. They had weeks of rehearsal before making their live debut at Redcar's Windsor Ballroom on September 26, 1970. It was a chemistry show. Brian had an unparalleled charisma, voice, and theatrical presence. They were an ideal combination of charisma, skill, and taste when they were together. They would be known all across the globe in no time, a sound that is uniquely lovely. The suite has always had an aversion to sounding generic. The infectiously melodic music of groups like the Monkees and the Arkies served as an inspiration, as did the more serious rock of acts like The Who. Because of this, they opted to combine the two. They blended harsh guitars and forceful percussion with the upbeat harmonies of pop music. They became known for this sound, which fused bubblegum pop with heavy rock. It set them apart from other bands of their era by giving them a distinct sound. Although they were ahead of their time, the suite did shape the sound that would be influential to glam metal bands in the future. It was a humble beginning to their journey. They weren't even on their own record when they made their debut. They made an appearance on Jimmy Ding, a cheap compilation CD, in December 1970. The album was named after the popular song by a duet called The Pipkins, which was featured on one side of the record, while the suite's 3 Parlophone singles were featured on the other side. The inclusion of guitarist Andy Scott on the album cover belies the fact that he did not contribute musically to any of the tracks. It wasn't a huge leap, but the band did great things with it. It would be only a matter of time before the world took note of their growing sound. A watershed moment occurred in December 1970 when the suite made its television debut on the hit show Liftoff. When they sang their new single, Funny Funny, it was obvious that something extraordinary was about to happen. They inked a management deal with Nicky Chin and Mike Chapman, a successful songwriting duo around this period. The band signed a global recording deal with RCA Records, SU with the exception of North America, where Bell Records was in charge of their releases and Phil Wainman returned as executive producer. Chen and Chapman's Funny Funny was released by RCA in March 1971. After breaking into the top 20 in a number of countries, the song became their debut worldwide smash. However, not all that they came into contact with became golden. May 1971 saw the reissue of All You'll Ever Get From Me by EMI, but the song was still not a hit. Next, in June 1971 came Coco, a smash hit that peaked at number 2 in the UK. Alexander Graham Bell, the song that came after it, didn't do as well, reaching number 33. Despite the song's success, session musicians continued to play the majority of the instruments. Vocals were mostly performed by band members during that point. The suite's debut studio album, 1971's Funny How Sweet Coco Can Be, was out in November of that year. Covers of popular songs by artists like The Love and Spoonful, The Supremes' Reflections, and Chin and Chapman's new singles were all a part of it. Phil Wainman served as producer, and Richard Dodd and Eric Holland were engineers during the album's recording in London. Despite its lack of chart success, it marked a significant milestone. It was a huge confidence booster for the band because it demonstrated their abilities. Fame all over the world, guitars, and glitter. The suite were unbeatable by 1972. After its February release, Papa Joe soared to the top of the Swedish and Finnish charts and peaked at number 11 in the United Kingdom. 2 more UK top 40 hits, Little Willie and Wigwam Bam, followed. Following its reissue in 1973, Little Willie became their most successful single in the United States, reaching number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. For the band, these songs were a watershed moment. When the members of the suite began playing each instrument on Wigwam Bam, it gave the song a more aggressive and self-assured sound. Blockbuster spent 5 weeks at the top of the UK charts in January 1973. Hellraiser, their subsequent song, peaked at number 2 shortly after the July 1973 publication of their debut American album, The Suite. Now everyone knew the band's name. They made appearances on shows like Supersonic and Top of the Pops to promote their music. The appearance of bassist Steve Priest in a German military outfit with a Nazi armband during one Blockbuster performance on Top of the Pops generated quite a commotion. While it did cause some uproar, it also demonstrated the extent to which the band was prepared to shock its fans. Glitter, T-Rex, Queen Slade, and Wizard were among the glam rock icons that the suite embraced wholeheartedly. They were very energetic on stage, sported outrageous clothes, and used ostentatious makeup. However, anxiety was building beneath the surface of all the glitz. Being stereotyped as a bubblegum pop group was something the band really disliked. They aspired to be acknowledged for their rock music credentials. They were managed by Chin and Chapman, who insisted on the band's pop image and produced catchy songs that were commercially successful, but didn't represent their genuine sound. The suite began penning their own darker tracks, to be included on the flip side of their singles in an effort to strike a balance. They opted to play rock songs and medleys of oldies, instead of their early pop hits like Funny Funny and Papa Joe when they performed Leave. The adjustment was not well received by many. In 1973, at a concert in Killarn, the audience started tossing bottles at the performers. While some pointed fingers at their glossy outfits, lip gloss, and makeup, others claimed that the crowd just didn't know the music. Later that year, they published the Ballroom Blitz, a smash single inspired by The Wild Night. Regardless of the controversy, the show's popularity skyrocketed, particularly in the United Kingdom, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Australia. Somewhere else, the band chose to shorten their name by the year's end 1973. After that, they would just be referred to as Suite. A new beginning was signaled by the seemingly insignificant alteration. They were hell-bent on reclaiming their sound and their public persona. Chin and Chapman had become a source of frustration for them since, although their songs had catapulted them to fame, they had also been stuck in a pop image that they had outgrown. One of their songs, Dynamite, was actually rejected by the band before another group, Mud, used it as a smash, started composing their own songs in an effort to establish themselves as legitimate rock artists. Sweet Fanny Adams was recorded in April 1974 with the assistance of producer Phil Wayneman and engineer Peter Coleman. Sweet Fi and Set Me Free were only two of the many self-penned hard rock songs that made up the album. It was a whole different side of the band, brash, uninhibited, and unfettered by the bubblegum label, moving away from a glittery image and toward a more serious one. Their sound became heavier and their appearance resembled that of conventional rockers. Their now iconic use of high-pitched vocal harmonies was also present on the record. Unfortunately, disaster struck at this time. Brian Connolly was the victim of a stain fight that broke out while he was recording the CD. He had significant injuries, including damage to his throat. When he sang, his voice changed forever. No You Don't, Into the Night, and Restless are just a few of the songs that featured Steve Priest and Andy Scott as main vocalists due to this. Despite seeing a professional for his condition, Brian was still able to complete the album. In order to conceal the truth from getting out, the band publicly stated that he suffered from a throat ailment. Peppermint Twist Rebel Roser peaked at number 1 in several countries, including Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, while the album failed to yield any singles in the UK. Despite the band's ignorance, Sweet Fanny Adams became the only non-compilation album by the band to reach the UK Top 40 upon release. Pete Townshend even asked them to open for the World Health Organization in June 1974 at Charlton Athletics football field. Unfortunately, they had to cancel due to Brian's throat injury. For a group that had long admired The Who and frequently performed cover versions of their songs, it was a devastating time. When things started to go awry, Sweet were already rapidly changing, moving away from pop stardom and becoming genuine rock icons. The Sweet began touring the US in 1978, performing alongside such heavy hitters as Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band. It ought to have been Brian Connolly's next professional peak. Things were starting to go wrong behind the scenes of the lights and the cheers. The band's North American tour began in March and ended in May, and it all came tumbling down in Birmingham, Alabama on May 3rd. That night, officials from Capitol Records were in the crowd, all set to witness the band's performance. Unfortunately, the performance was a bust rather than a triumph. Brian looked really inebriated when he stepped onto the stage. He walked with an unsteady gait and a garbled voice. The remainder of the band had to carry on without him after he collapsed halfway through the performance. Everything changed in that instant. Since the event made Brian and the rest of the group seem bad, the show had to conclude early. Things did not improve upon their temporary return to Britain. His drinking was getting out of hand, and he was losing touch with the band. A month later, as they continued their second US tour leg, performing alongside Foghat and Alice Cooper, the group's tension had reached an intolerable level. Aside from the growing suspicions about his dependability and health, Brian's relationship with his bandmates, particularly the ones he had previously been closest to, had begun to deteriorate. As the tour came to a close in early July 1978, the band's insecurities became plainly apparent, serving as the last straw. In October of that year, the suite convened in Clearwell Castle to begin writing songs for their upcoming album. After they finished writing for Cut Above the Rest, they headed to a townhouse studio in London's Shepherd's Bush neighborhood to start recording. However, the band's internal strife accompanied them on their journey. A lot of people were worried about Brian's health and his erratic conduct. The studio environment was tense because of his illness, which made recording sessions challenging. For his vocal parts, Brian enlisted the aid of Mick Tucker, a longtime friend and fellow founding member. Given their shared history and relationship, the band thought Mick could bring Brian's finest performance out. Their goal in recording multiple songs with Brian's vocals was to recreate the suite's legendary aura. However, everyone was let down by the outcomes when the sessions were over. Once strong and authoritative, Brian's voice had become weak. There was no way the band could continue in this state. It was November 2, 1978, when Brian Connolly stealthily departed from the suite. The news was made public by the band's manager, David Walker, on February 23, 1979, a few months later. According to the official release, Brian is departing to pursue country rock music as a solo artist. The truth was that he couldn't have continued due to his health, his drinking, and the increasing distance between the band and himself. When he left, a chapter was closed. The solitary path of an individual artist. Things did not go according to plan for Brian's career rebuilding after he left the suite. Roger Greenway's Don't You Know a Lady was his debut single. It was disappointing because it had no effect. After Brian's contract with Polydor ended in 1982, he inked a deal with Carrera Records, a French label. In March of 1982, his new single, Hypnotized, was set for release by the UK magazine record label Business. After 3 long years away from the suite, he finally released a solo single with this one. Once again, the RCA edition of the hard rock tune, written by Joe Lynn Turner and originally performed by Fandango, failed to chart in Europe. The album, which was supposed to be published in August 1983, never materialized despite his having recorded multiple new songs for it. Nevertheless, Brian persisted. He was Pat Benatar's opening act for 3 January 1983 concerts in Birmingham, Newcastle, and London's Hammersmith Odeon. John Verity of Argent and Terry Utley of Smokey were among the gifted musicians that played in his band Encore. Sick and Tired, Red Hair Rage, and Burning the Candle were among their original compositions, while Hypnotized, Fox on the Run, and Windy City were among their older covers. Later on, bootleg recordings circulated several of these tunes. Another setback occurred as Brian was striving to restore his music career. A colossal tax bill for their prior earnings was levied against him and other members of the suite by the British tax authorities, the Inland Revenue. Millions were the sum total of the evaluation. Brian had to liquidate his home in order to cover his portion. All of his hard work was going down the drain, even though he was once a household star in the glam rock scene, the latest suit in the uphill battle to maintain momentum. Even though Brian's health was deteriorating, he resumed touring in 1984 with a new band named The New Suite. His performances in Europe and the UK were met with enthusiastic crowds, especially in West Germany. His concerts there consistently sold out, and he continued to perform there even after Germany reunified, returning year after year. By 1985, his life away from the stage was in shambles, though he still performed periodically in the UK and Denmark. He also filed for a divorce with Marilyn that same year. They finally finalized the split in 1986. He reconnected with Sweet's original guitarist, Frank Torp, in 1987, a year after that. Sharantina is the name of the song that the two longtime friends agreed to record together. Despite its modest size, the personal endeavor evoked pleasant recollections of simpler times. Years after Brian passed away, in 1998, the song finally made its debut. A short reunion of the original Sweet lineup was organized by producer Mike Chapman in 1988. Those in Los Angeles who are Brian Mick Tucker, Steve Priest, and Andy Scott. In an effort to create an album for MCA Records, they attempted to record updated renditions of Action and the Ballroom Blitz. However, due to Brian's voice damage, the endeavor was subsequently shelved. Moving back into the new suite, he continued to perform whenever he could. When Brian and the rest of the original band got back together in 1990, it was for a documentary screening at Tower Records in London. Concurrently, preparations were underway to take the new suite on a tour of Australia. However, Brian's health deteriorated significantly throughout the lengthy journey to Adelaide. He missed multiple concerts due to his hospitalization for dehydration and related issues. His band continued the tour without him, playing one more gig in Melbourne. It was obvious that touring was taking a toll on his health. This did not stop him from continuing to attempt. Brian kept singing at oldies events and festivals all throughout Europe in the early 1990s. The band's van was broken into in 1992 while they were playing at the Bristol Hippodrome, and they took some priceless demo cassettes of new songs with them. Legal complications ensued, adding insult to injury. Fans and promoters were confused as a result of the feud between Brian and Andy Scott over the usage of the cute moniker. A truce was eventually agreed upon. Andy's band was renamed Andy Scott's Suit, while Brian's band was rechristened Brian Connolly's Suit. Even as their arguments escalated, Brian's band continued performing and even went on a tour of the Middle East. The new suite performed in Bahrain and Dubai in 1994. Brian reconciled with Mick Tucker and Steve Priest, two of his former bandmates, around that period. He was even asked to perform at the wedding of Priest's daughter Lisa, where he and Lisa were longtime acquaintances. For an instant, the resentment dissipated and the enchantment reappeared. Sure, let's get going. Finally, a return. The year 1995 was Brian Connolly's final-ditch effort to get his music career back on track. With the release of his new album, Let's Go, he also issued a slew of promotional items. That he had more music to share was his way of suggesting he wasn't done yet. His private life also began to improve in that year. They had a son together. He met his partner, Jean, a few years ago. He had found solace in the joy of parenthood after years of suffering. It was that year that Jean did something truly spectacular for him as well. By some stroke of luck, she located Brian's biological relatives. She persisted until they located his aunt in Ontario, Canada, and she told them the truth about his biological mother. In 1989, Brian got the news that his mom had died. On the other hand, he learned that his sister and brother were both alive and well. After spending his entire life confused about his origins, he finally found answers when he crossed paths with them in England. Despite the improvements in his family life, his health remained a constant worry. After multiple heart attacks in 1981, Brian was partially paralyzed on his left side. A neurological disease eventually resulted from this. The use of prescription drugs, heavy drinking, and smoking for many years contributed to his difficulties. In spite of his health problems, Brian would not give up performing. He continued to play to smaller venues, such as Butlin's holiday camps, where his devoted audience still loved him. Next, a documentary called Don't Leave Me This Way was broadcasted in November 1996 on the British network Channel 4. It examined Brian's ascent to stardom, the fall of the suite, and the emotional toll that his success had on him. In the show, Brian exhibited obvious signs of weakness, including trembling and a limp. Still, he continued to do gigs at Butlin's despite his deteriorating condition. His passion for music clearly outweighed his physical limitations. His unwavering resolve to persevere in the face of adversity profoundly touched the audience. A little over 2 months later, on December 5, 1996, Brian made his final appearance at the Bristol Hippodrome. He was a member of the glitter band Experience, which also included Slade 2. The fact that it would be his last concert was unknown at the time. In spite of the constant encouragement, his physical health was deteriorating before his eyes, but he would not let himself give up. Final moments of a famous musician. A major decline in Brian's health occurred around the beginning of 1997. He had a second heart attack in January and went to the hospital in a daze. Even though physicians warned him it was unsafe, he insisted on going home after a week. Wexham Park Hospital was the site of his subsequent emergency visit just 1 week later. Brian Connolly was only 51 years old when he died on February 9, 1997. Kidney and liver failure, in addition to recurrent heart attacks, was the reason. It was the tragic end for a man whose performances had captivated audiences across the globe. Denham, Buckinghamshire's most holy name Roman Catholic Church, was the site of his funeral on February 17th. Nicola and Michelle, his children, said their last goodbye by scattering his ashes over the water after the ceremony. Those left behind include his companion Jean, his ex-wife Marilyn, and their one-year-old son Brian Jr. His devoted followers planned a tribute performance to honor his life and music in London's Camden Palace in October 1998. On February 9, 2000, a memorial plaque was installed at Brickspear Crematorium in Middlesex, funded in part by the funds raised. Years down the road, in 2013, Brian Jeter would try out for the X Factor, much like his famous dad. Unfortunately, the reality of Brian's latter years was devastating. After dominating the charts with singles like Fox on the Run and Ballroom Blitz, the lead singer passed away without a fortune. The Inland Revenue had awarded him a multi-million-pound tax bill, and he was compelled to sell his mansion in order to settle the debt. He and Jean were down to their last remaining council apartment, where he performed meager performances at Butlins to make ends meet. They had a son. Millions of people used to love him, but his stardom and wealth had long since vanished. His health had been irreparably compromised since the early 1980s, when he was left feeble and partially paralyzed by a series of heart attacks. He was never the same. Legal disputes over the lovely name persisted even in his dying years, further straining an already precarious life. He had a small success with his 1995 album, Let's Go, which was his last attempt at music. The one thing that had always been important to him, his music, did not stop him from continuing to play for his fans. Brian Connolly's journey was marked by triumph and tragedy. In his last years, he battled disease, financial difficulties, and waning celebrity. He had been the golden voice of glam rock. Still, he kept on performing and attempting. His legacy will be that of a man who sacrificed all for his music, even when he felt he had nothing more to offer.